Good to see you. Welcome back to the Dangerous Tales Library. I have collections of unnerving stories from many centuries in this place, but also one or two stories of my own, like this one. Have you ever been in a place on your own that's meant to be full of people? When it's bustling and busy, you don't give it much thought. But when you're on your own, it feels wrong somehow. It's called a fear of liminal spaces, very common. Doesn't matter if it's a large empty house, or a school, a church, or even an old theatre. This is The Black Cloak by Andy David Jones, narrated by the author. It was a somber affair in the foyer. The tables were dragged out and placed together with less energy and enthusiasm than was custom. The plastic chairs, most of them beyond their useful life by now, placed around the large rectangular configuration. Pens and paper placed in front of each member of the committee. The summer of 1974 would be, they were sure of it this time, the last meeting of the Cangleton Players Committee. A much-loved amateur theatre group, considered one of the very best in Surrey, full stop. It had been going since 1950, 1 year away from their 25th anniversary. There had been a chance that they might continue, but in the end, it simply wasn't to be. The finances were fine, until they weren't. Things fell apart quickly after Peter Mace, the treasurer of the time, died. Cancer. He had known it was coming for some time and had confided in a number of committee members. They had left him to keep an eye on the books, though. Too uncomfortable to talk about him handing over to a successor. Furthermore, he was keen to keep at it. It gave him something to do, a sense of purpose in his final months. Who would deprive him of that? But only when he died did the rest of the committee see what sort of a mess they were in. Peter had taken out loans on behalf of the limited liability company that was set up to run the theatre. But no one knew of it. They just assumed the ticket sales were doing well, and the things he bought for the theatre was in budget. Peter had arranged for better lighting and even improved seating, replacing the uncomfortable plastic seats in the auditorium for red velvet ones, which he said were slightly used, and he got at a knockdown price. Turns out that wasn't true. He must have wanted to leave the theatre he loved in a much better place, a lasting legacy. His heart was in the right place, but the accounts were deeply, deeply wrong. After he died, the Cangleton Players Limited was left with a debt in the tens of thousands of pounds. Some of the better-off committee members were happy to put some money towards clearing the debt. But there was only so much they could do, and there was only so much money they could raise before the full amount needed to be paid off. Despite a heroic effort and a campaign supported by the local newspaper, they were too far behind in payment, and only halfway through paying the principal sum consolidated by the bank. The bank informed them that it, in effect, owned the theatre itself, as Pete had put it up for collateral. Signatures had been faked, and in one or two cases the committee members had signed things Peter asked them to, without realizing what they were signing. But he seemed to be on top of his brief, so they signed without question. There was no question that Peter had stolen any money. They could see that every penny had been reinvested in the theatre he loved. It was thought that he wanted to see it looking and working brilliantly after he died. What happened after he was gone? Well, maybe he thought they'd work it out. but they couldn't. "Well, let's come to order then," said Marjorie, the chair of the committee, banging her pen lethargically on the table. She didn't need to. No one on the committee had spoken since they came in. The air was heavy with the weight of defeat. Just the buzz of the square fluorescent lights above. She looked around her fellow committee members before speaking. A lovely bunch, many of whom had been here from the start. Most were retired, of course. That was always the way. But a number of them well-respected members of the community in Cangleton. Posters and black and white photos adorned the dark green stained walls of the theatre's foyer. The cloakroom behind Marjorie. The bar, closed up with the metal shutters down and emptied of all drink, to her left. The toilets, also upgraded by Peter with a loan they couldn't pay off, to the right. The double doors, open and letting the late Saturday afternoon light in straight ahead. Just to the right of them, the double doors into the theatre itself. And a corridor further down to the rehearsal room, dressing rooms, tool shop, backstage, and costume storage. All encased in the original prefabricated thin walls and corrugated iron roof. Not an expensive building by any means. Yet still, soon to be no more. She sighed. "Thank you for coming," Marjorie said. "One last time?" Surprised by the crack in her voice. She was 78 and was only realizing how much she loved this place once it was slipping from her hands. She had devoted herself to the place since she retired. And doubly so after her husband passed away 15 years ago. Debbie Richards, the local hairdresser, and a real whiz at makeup, started to cry. Alan, an elderly gent and former city trader, patted her back gently. "Oh, Debbie," said Marjorie. "We all feel the same, my love. I won't keep you here long. It's a testament to the love we have for this theatre that so many of you came at all. I'm officially, and for the second and last time, disbanding the Cangleton Players Committee. We've still got work to do, stripping away anything we want to keep. The artwork here, for example. We should divvy it up in any way you wish. It was by some miracle that we had a second chance. But sadly, we have to admit that we fell short." The second chance she spoke of, by a rather unfortunate situation. Something that no one there would publicly talk about. The theatre itself was a pretty basic, low-quality construction. Those wafer-thin walls somehow managed to retain too much heat in the summer and froze patrons in the winter. But people loved the place and kept coming back, season after season. It was hoped at one stage that planning permission would prevent anything different being built. Maybe that would delay the sale for the bank and give them more time to raise the funds needed. Sadly, that wasn't to be. A real estate man called Greg Samuels had shown interest in the plot. Samuels was friends with a few key members of the council. In his 50s, but looking to his credit at least 10 years younger, he was fit and healthy, a keen runner and a squash player, and very skilled at sealing development deals. His plans for the site of the Cangleton Players Theatre? Simply to knock it down and build a 4-story apartment block in its place. Planning permission had not yet been given, but it was widely known that his council friends would accommodate his scheme. But something happened before he could sign all the paperwork. Samuels had been given a set of keys from the estate agent. Apart from a single set still in Marjorie's possession, the only 2 remaining sets were with the estate agency at the bank's request. Samuels had taken them and wandered around the theatre one evening, just to see if there was anything he could sell from the theatre before knocking it all down. He had unlocked the double doors, and then, this is crucial to know, locked them behind himself from the inside. So he was utterly alone. What he had done in there is still a mystery. But after 2 days, his wife had contacted the police. He had gone off for a day or so previously. The gossip in Cangleton was that he had been having an affair with someone he employed at his development office. But he had never disappeared this long without contacting his long-suffering wife. The police went to the theatre, where he was last known to have been heading, and found the doors to be locked. They finally tracked down Marjorie for her set of keys to the theatre, which she happily obliged. They were in her drawer, right where she left them, undisturbed, some 3 weeks earlier. In there, they finally found Greg Samuels, in the costume storage room in the back, dead. A suspected heart attack, according to the coroner. Surprising for a man of his age and fitness, but these things happen. Only 2 things were out of place in the costume storage room. The glass cover of a framed poster for a performance of An Ideal Husband by Oscar Wilde, put on by the players in 1958, still hung on the wall, but was cracked and tilted askew. And on the floor by Greg Samuels' body, a black cloak. A costume piece, presumably from a long-forgotten performance. It was thought that he had pulled it off the rack and down with him as the pain in his chest took hold. Of the many items purchased by Peter Mace that the theatre couldn't afford, one was a fancy CCTV system. It recorded onto a magnetic tape from just one static camera on the outside. He said that it would lower their insurance, which it did, but not enough to justify the expense. Luckily, it was running on the night Greg Samuels went into the theatre. It showed him go in. No one had sneaked in beforehand, and no one had tried to get in before or after the fact. And there were no signs of forced entry anywhere else in the building. The police concluded that there was no foul play, death by natural causes. It was, of course, a tragic event, but it gave the Cangleton Players Committee a little reprieve. They had not formally wound the business up at that time, though they had had a meeting, rather like the one this Saturday afternoon, to bring things to a close. They were still many thousands of pounds away from clearing their debt to the bank, and with the rising interest, paying it all off was still a stretch. But they now had a chance. Samuels' deal had not gone through. If they could push hard one last time, maybe they could get all the money together before the bank sold the property again. It had been an almighty struggle, and the committee had moved mountains in ways Marjorie thought impossible. And they were so close, just £1,100 shy of their goal. But then, the bank informed them of a new buyer. The man who would be walking through the double doors and into the foyer any minute now. "Look," said Marjorie, trying to keep it together. "We did something wonderful here. I look at all these posters and photos in the foyer, and I think about the wonderful memories we've made. I shall treasure these things deeply. The bank has taken away our theatre for the second and final time. These memories we've made together will stay with us for the rest of our lives. Now, the curtain closes." "Maybe," said a haggard voice in the corner, on the far end of the tables placed together for the meeting. It was Maggie Williamson. She was the oldest member of the committee, some 10 years on Marjorie, the committee chair guessed, and one of the less sociable members. She looked after the costumes, amassed from more than 2 decades of shows. She was competent, but cold. Marjorie didn't say anything. The rest of the committee turned to Maggie. She took a moment before speaking.
"We've had one reprieve,"
she finally said.
"Who is to say we wouldn't get another?"
If it wasn't so ridiculous to think of, Maggie's tone almost sounded sinister. Marjorie couldn't help swallowing before saying, "Sadly, I think this is it, Maggie. We came close, and if we had more time..."
"The deeds are not signed yet,"
interrupted the elderly costumer.
"just as they weren't with the man wanting to build the flats. We shouldn't be hasty in assuming that..."
"Oh, didn't realise I was interrupting a meeting at the old folks' home."
The sudden South London accent booming over Maggie made everyone jump and look up. Except for Maggie herself, who didn't even glance to see who it was. A large, round man in his early 40s stood on the threshold of the entrance to the foyer, the setting sun silhouetting his bulky frame. He was wearing a dark blue suit. It was a little tight on him, and the front of his white shirt was hanging out slightly. His roughed, thick, dark hair and pale complexion made him look like a man who would be incapable of ever really tidying himself up. It was Adrian Hill, the new owner of the theatre. Not that it was going to be a theatre under his ownership. Adrian Hill owned a business creatively named Hill Fashion. It sounded grand, but really he just imported cheap dresses from somewhere in the Far East, made in sweatshops, then exported to the UK in shipping containers. He slapped his label on them and sold them to high street chains at gratuitously marked up prices. Not a hugely successful man by any means, but business was going well for Mr. Hill, and he had bought the building with that in mind. Marjorie stood up, almost involuntarily. "Oh, Mr. Hill..."
"Call me Ady, darling,"
he said, with a disrespectful grin.
"It's only my bank manager who calls me Mr. Hill."
Marjorie didn't call him anything when she spoke again.
"We're the outgoing committee for the Cangleton Players," she said. "We were just finishing up our last meeting and..."
But he had stopped listening to her almost as soon as she started speaking. Walking around the foyer, looking at the posters.
"Not really one for theatre myself,"
he said, speaking loudly, but not to anyone in particular.
"All a bit poncy to me, you know what I mean?"
Marjorie could tell that Alum, who had been comforting poor Debbie, was about to stand up and give Mr. Hill both barrels, so she spoke before he could.
"We weren't expecting you just yet," she said.
"Yeah, well, I'm here now, ain't I?"
he said, still looking at the pictures on the wall.
"Thought I'd have a butcher's, see what bits I can knock through, maximise the space for the merchandise."
Most of the committee had their heads bowed. In sorrow? Marjorie thought. Then, for the first time, Adrian Hill turned to Marjorie and pointed outside.
"That camera thing real?"
"The CCTV? Yes. Yes, it is."
"And it, like, records and that?"
"Yes. I don't know quite how it works, but it records on a special tape. It's running now, in the little office behind the bar. It can record continuously for 4 days before it records over what was there before. We can show you if you like."
"Nah," he interrupted. "I'll get one of me skivvies from the office to have a look."
He then turned to face them all, held out his hands. Marjorie didn't know what he was trying to do at first.
"Keys?"
he eventually said, like it was somehow obvious what he was waiting for.
"Oh, I've got them,"
said Marjorie, walking over to him.
"Here."
"Cheers, darling,"
he said.
"Now, off you all pop."
Marjorie turned to the others. She didn't know what to do.
"Well, we were just finishing up."
"I think you've finished, haven't you?" he said. "I mean, it's all closed down. What is there left to say?"
Marjorie panicked as Alum stood up quickly. He walked over to this large, unfriendly man, but then thought better of it and walked out. A minute or so later, most of the rest followed.
You need me to show you around?
Asked Marjorie, hoping the answer was no.
I think I can handle it,
He said sarcastically.
Off you go.
He said, practically pushing her out the door.
And you too, Grandma?
He said behind Marjorie. She turned to see who he was talking to. Then she noticed that Maggie Williamson was still sat down in her seat in the corner. Marjorie watched Maggie sit there with a scowl on her face, staring off into the middle distance.
You hard of hearing, love?
Hill shouted, getting up into her face. After a moment, she turned to him, taking her time. She got up from the seat slowly, to her full height. Only just 5 foot. Still without taking her eyes off him. It was then that Marjorie felt a tingle of fear running down the back of her spine. She didn't know why. But it was something in the smile Maggie gave to Hill. A cruel smile. Not pleasant to see. Hill clearly felt unnerved by it too. He stopped talking and took 2 paces back. Taking her time, with that sinister smile still on her face, Maggie walked out of the double doors and into the fading early evening light.
Jesus,
said Hill, recovering now.
Where did you dig her up from?
Marjorie didn't know what to say. And before she had time to think of something, Hill was ushering her outside and closing the double doors behind him. She stood there for a moment as she heard him lock them from the inside. For a bitter moment, she wondered out loud if that would be the last time she'd walk into the theatre that she loved so much. The last of the committee were getting into their cars and grumbling to each other about that oafish man and other less charitable phrases. Marjorie walked over to her car, fishing out the keys, and only then did she notice it. Though they had only just left at about the exact same time, Maggie Williamson was nowhere to be seen. A.D. Hill let out an involuntary sigh of relief as he closed the double doors and locked them. It was good to be alone. That old bat had given him the heebie-jeebies. But it was forgotten about in the next 30 seconds, as he wandered over to the bar in the hope there might be a nice little drop of something those old biddies had left behind. He opened up the metal shutters after working out how to do it. To see the bar inside was empty. He walked into the middle and had a poke around under the counter. There was a little fridge, but that was empty too. Through the back, like the old woman who gave him the keys had said, was the CCTV. It all looked a little complicated, and a bit expensive for a little am-dram theatre. He saw the cars from the oldies of the committee driving off, and a minute later, the car park was deserted. And would you look at that?
Jackpot.
There was half a bottle of whiskey on the table with the CCTV screen, sitting on top of the video recorder thingy, which was whirring away quietly. And a glass too. The bottle said Hazelwood, which is a brand Hill had never heard of. But hey, finders keepers, right? He took the bottle and the glass back to the bar, rinsed the glass in the sink there, and poured himself a generous measure. Oh, that felt good. Warm and silky smooth down his throat. He poured another and left the bottle there. He took the glass with him as he exited the bar and walked towards the theatre double doors. It was black dark when he opened them. Took him a good few seconds to find the lights
which were a bunch of switches, all patched together on the wall to his left. As he switched each on, batches of fluorescent lights illuminated the space from above, all with that same hum he heard in the foyer. The stage wasn't bare like he assumed. It was dressed to crudely resemble a beach. A yellow cloth draped over half the stage to represent sand, and a bright blue ocean painted on flats at the back. To the right, near the front of the stage, a large red parasol with white polka dots and a deck chair. He hadn't a clue what play they had been staging.
Looks like shit,
he said to himself as he swigged back all the whiskey in his glass. Yeah, that whiskey was good. Should he get another? Maybe in a minute, he thought, putting the glass thoughtlessly on the arm of a red velvet chair on the front row. There must have been over 100 chairs like that where the audience would sit, raised up so the back row was some 15 foot above the front. At the back, a small room with a glass window and an open door, with some control panels to turn on and off the stage lights, which hung ominously above Hill's head. He saw a gap in the stage between two of the flat panels painted crudely with the sea, depicting or attempting to depict the white foam lapping up onto the artificial beach. Stepping up about 1.5 feet onto the raised stage, Hill walked across it, carelessly scuffing the yellow cloth that draped the floor, and made his way backstage. He smiled. The backstage was quite large, end to end. Getting rid of the stage and selling off those seats for a few quid, he'd be able to fit a lot of dresses in this one room. And he's already got a top-of-the-line security camera thing as well, so that'd be good for the insurance premium. But it got even better. The walls that separated backstage from the rooms beyond didn't look like they were load-bearing. Not needed with such a flimsy structure. Maybe he'd be able to knock through and make this storage room even bigger. Nice one. It was then that he heard it. A faint sound. Like someone knocking into some coat hangers. A light tingle. Maybe it was the wind. A window open back there. But it had been a still day. He walked past a few rooms and heard it again. Coming from what must have been a small room at the very back.
Bloody rats, I bet,
he said, out loud to himself, trying to dampen down a fear that, for some reason, started to rise in his chest. He swung open the door fast, with confidence, or so he hoped. The lights were already on inside. 2 bare bulbs. It was a poky little room, stuffed with metal rails, all with dozens and dozens of costumes on each. Weird and wonderful stuff, brightly coloured princess outfits, vicar's shirts with dog collars, police uniforms, boxes of hats, ball gowns, and so much more besides. There was no doubt the noise came from here. And it was the sound of coat hangers knocking together, so it made sense that it would come from the costume storage room. But it was now completely silent. And there were no windows here to even open, so it couldn't have been the wind. He looked on the floor and around. No droppings, no little tears in the costumes, so no rats. The walls, like all the other walls in this place, were littered with photos and framed posters of past shows put on by the Cangleton players. The only thing vaguely out of place was a poster with the glass cracked. Hill looked at it and straightened it up.
An Ideal Husband by Oscar Wilde, he said to himself. Huh, wasn't he that poofter?
He chuckled to himself, feeling the faint fear dissipating as he did so, but still wanting to leave the room. It was then that he heard the movement.
To his right, the sound of fabric on fabric. Clothes rustling against other clothes. But it can't have been. He had no sense of someone else in the room with him. He turned to his right, and his heart leapt as a sight, impossible and yet so real, met his eyes. A black cloak, maybe of Victorian design, had somehow, of its own accord, slipped off of a coat hanger and was gliding through the air, past the other costume items, and heading towards him with gathering speed. Hill didn't have time to cry out in terror as the flimsy cloak pushed into him with impossible force, knocking him into several of the wall-mounted posters and photos, several of them crashing onto the floor, and the glass of the Oscar Wilde poster finally meeting the earth and shattering into 1,000 pieces. The force of the push from the cloak would have knocked Hill onto the floor were it not for the wall saving him. He screamed, then pushed the cloak away. It relented for just a second, and he darted out of the room and slammed the door shut. He kept running, but looked back to see, to his utter horror, the door handle of the costume storage room turn, all by itself. No, Jesus! He hadn't moved so fast since he was a young boy, his immense weight putting a strain on his heart. But it didn't matter. He had to get out of there. Just run, go, flee. Hill darted through the backstage area, hearing the costume storage door swing open and smack into the wall. There was no time to look behind, as he knew now, he just knew that every second wasted was a second closer to death. He dived onto the stage, knocking into a painted flat. The low-quality painting of the waves lapping onto the beach, collapsing face first onto the stage and crushing the large parasol with a crunch. Still, he didn't look behind him. The double doors to leave the theatre were in sight. He just had to get to them. And it was only as he did so that he comprehended, against all reason, that they were closed, when he absolutely, positively left them open. It was almost inevitable that they would not open. He pulled and pushed and banged on them with all his might, but they didn't yield. Then he saw the shadow of the cloak behind him. Hill squealed in terror and ran towards the red velvet audience chairs, knocking the glass over that he'd left on the arm of a chair on the front row. It smashed on the floor. He clambered over the chairs, desperate to get to the lighting box on the top. The door was open still. Maybe he could get there and close the door and stop that cloak or whatever was controlling it from getting in. But it was too late. He wasn't fast enough. The cloak, its flimsy fabric, pushed him over with the force of a bull. He fell onto his back, splayed out over 2 rows of chairs. The cloak. Just a cloak. No one behind it and nothing in it. Landed on top of him, pressing into his face. Powerful. Inescapable. It became harder to breathe. He pushed and pulled the cloak, but he couldn't rip the fabric, and he couldn't push it away. Its strength was beyond that of a mortal man. He couldn't inhale. He was feeling dizzy, tired and terrified at the same time. He wasn't sure if he'd stopped fighting back. Things were fuzzy. He couldn't think anymore. Then a name came into his head. Greg Samuels. Why that name? Where had he heard it, and why now? Then he remembered. The previous buyer. Real estate man or something. Greg Samuels. He died in this place too. It was the last thought Adrian Hill ever had before everything went black. The investigation had taken months. It was understandable. A new owner, a man in good health, dies in the theatre he was just about to buy. Strange, but it happens. But the second owner, admittedly not the fittest of men, also dies alone in similar circumstances. Surrey police were not stupid. Though try as they might, it was even more watertight this time. Adrian Hill had Marjorie's keys, the only set outside of the two at the estate agents that were right where they were supposed to be, locked in the agent's office and untouched. There was again no sign of forced entry anywhere, and the police triple-checked this time. The CCTV recorded every single one of the committee leaving the theatre at the same time. Maggie Williamson, the penultimate one, followed by Marjorie. The earlier recording showed no one sneaking into the place beforehand. Every member of the committee was interviewed by the police. They were all disappointed to be losing the theatre, but they were upstanding members of the community. Not one of them had so much as a speeding ticket to their names. Maggie Williamson gave some of the police inspectors a slightly unnerving feeling, but it was safe to say that a frail 88-year-old lady couldn't have killed the 22-stone Adrian Hill with the brute force required. And even if she did, how did she sneak back into the building after leaving? With no key. Adrian Hill was found splayed halfway up the auditorium seating, over several red velvet seats, a face of twisted agony. It was like he had suffocated. But, just like with Greg Samuels, the coroner finally put the death down to a heart attack. Despite some trauma and marks to his face and mouth, thought to be self-inflicted as the attack happened. And that was that. The sale of the theatre was cancelled for the second time. Hill's clothing business sold, and the theatre was once again put on the market, at the bank's insistence. However, things went differently this time. The committee, while stunned and deeply upset about what happened, wasted no time restarting their fundraising efforts. Many of them quietly, and to themselves, were glad they had been given a chance. They wished a man had not died, of course, but what had happened, happened. And it's not like Mr. Hill left them with a favourable impression. In the months where the police investigation froze any sale from going ahead, the committee managed to raise the funds needed to pay off the final loan. The theatre was now owned fully by the Cangleton players again, free and clear. It's why, once the investigation was over, the bustling atmosphere of the Cangleton Players Committee meeting was so vibrant. "Come on now," said Marjorie, banging her pen enthusiastically on the desk in the lobby to bring about order. "We can have our separate chats after we've concluded our meeting. First point on the agenda. I can confirm the Cangleton Players Limited is officially debt-free." She let the thunderous applause linger. It wasn't just the committee there today. Their families, past actors, set designers, and so many supporters had come out to celebrate. The bar was full, and a party of sorts was due to commence shortly. "The only thing left to discuss," Marjorie said with a smile, "is the programme for the coming season." Again, more cheering and applause. Once the details were sorted, and the drinks were flowing in the foyer, Marjorie found herself wandering into the theatre auditorium. She was surprised to see little old Maggie sitting on one of the audience seats. Chalk marks on the stage and around the double-door entrance were all that were left of the police presence from the past few months. They still hadn't been able to strike the stage from their last production of South Pacific. One of the flats from the back of the stage had fallen over and crushed the parasol, which incidentally belonged to Marjorie. Not that she minded much. She sat next to Maggie, who didn't seem to acknowledge her at first.
But nevertheless, the older lady said, without looking,
"Time to clean all this up."
"Yes," said Marjorie. "We can now. The police have told me. Looks like Mr. Hill burst in through here when he was having his panic attack or whatever it was. Look at the mess."
"We shall clean it up,"
said the old lady, still without looking at Marjorie. Marjorie looked at the sorry state of the stage, the carnage, the reminder of an awful ordeal that poor Mr. Hill must have gone through. He wasn't a nice man, not at all, but he didn't deserve whatever illness took him. As she looked, Marjorie noticed one thing out of place, aside from the general disarray. A black cloak, placed neatly on the corner of the stage. Not an item of costume from South Pacific, that's for sure. What was it doing there? Marjorie closed her eyes for a minute. She didn't know why, but something about that cloak just unsettled her somehow. "What do you think happened to him, Maggie?" "Mr. Hill," said Marjorie, opening her eyes and turning to the elderly lady. But she wasn't there. It made her jump for a moment, but then Marjorie turned her head and saw Maggie had got up and was bending over to pick up the cloak. Marjorie went to ask, "What do you think that's doing out here?" But before she could, Maggie Williamson looked at her, with that cruel smile she gave at the end of their previous meeting.
"I'll put this back where it belongs,"
she said. This has been The Black Cloak by Andy David Jones, narrated by the author. Thanks for stopping by. Remember, you can listen to these stories on your favorite podcast platform by searching for Dangerous Tales. And on YouTube, if you've enjoyed this tale, please hit the like button. And if you haven't yet done so, click subscribe and the notification bell so you don't miss any future Dangerous Tales.